It's G7 time here in Alberta.
Well, G7 leaders have touched down in the province.
These meetings will focus on world trade and international security, but wildfires, foreign interference, AI, and the war on Ukraine are also on the agenda.
The group of 7 is in the Rocky Mountains. And no, I'm not talking about the painters. France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US, and a lucky few plus ones, are taking in beautiful Kananaskis country.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to Kananaskis and the 2025 G7 Leaders Summit. I'm pleased all leaders are here, honored by your presence, in my home province, Alberta.
It's kind of giving destination wedding with Mark Carney as event planner-in-chief. On top of perfecting their landscape paintings, and after Emmanuel Macron hits his morning jog, on the agenda is security, energy, and securing quote-unquote partnerships of the future. But those talking points might get overshadowed by a couple other political events.
Israel has launched airstrikes into Iran, targeting both military and nuclear facilities, killing some of the most senior army officials and scientists.
Missiles streaked over Tel Aviv Friday, with some Iranian projectiles breaching Israel's air defenses.
In Ukraine, at least 4 people are dead after Russia launched a massive drone and missile attack on Kharkiv yesterday.
Let's talk about these wildfires across the country.
Well, thousands have been evacuated as dozens of wildfires rage in several provinces in Canada.
Several groups met to protest as G7 leaders start to touch down in Alberta.
Mark Carney was pressed Friday on his decision to extend Modi an invite.
Do you believe Mr. Modi was involved in the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar?
U.S. President Donald Trump has followed through on his tariff threats.
Canada is no rookie to summit chaos. The last time we hosted the G7 in 2018, it wrapped with a diplomatic food fight between Trump and our meek and mild Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And that's not my assessment. That is literally what Donald Trump called him after the G7. And yeah, this year's summit could go sideways. But it could also be a massive opportunity. Mark Carney says the U.S. is no longer the center of global politics. They've pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations Human Rights Council. As the U.S. takes a step back, could someone else step in? Could Canada? This episode, I'm talking to Matthew Holmes. He's the Executive Vice President, International and Chief of Public Policy with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And he's argued that this year's G7 summit in Canada could be the most important one yet. Let's get into it. Matthew, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me on.
So the G7 kicked off Sunday. I know you're in the area. You're in Banff, right?
That's right. Yeah.
It's a little ways away from Kananaskis, but what's the vibe right now where you are?
Yeah, so I'm sitting at the Banff Center for the Arts, and that's where all of the world media has been set up. So there are hundreds of outlets from all of the G7 nations, but also from many of the other invited countries. So it's pretty chaotic and frenetic, to be honest. I mean, like, we're in the woods. It's beautiful. The mountains are glorious. It's sunny. And then Banff is being Banff down the hill. There's, tourists and people kind of walking around, and there's all the shops. But then there's just banks of cameras and microphones, and people are holding selfie sticks and doing live hot takes.
What's happened so far? I know we're in the early stages, but any updates?
Yesterday afternoon when I was here, we were watching all of the various leaders come in by jet. And so you saw each of the world leaders arrive in sequence. It's all very choreographed. And they'd kind of come down and have the greeting party. Most of them took choppers from the airports. People were kind of sharing rumors, basically, as journalists do, what they're hearing, what isn't confirmed, what might be confirmed, and that kind of thing. And that's it's really everybody's trying to get kind of the hot take or what's the status. And it's a very dynamic and fluid environment.
You've argued that this year's G7 summit in Canada could be the most important G summit yet. Is it really more than just a bunch of politicians having a fancy lunch meeting? Make the case for me. How important is this summit?
Well, I'm sure there's a good lunch meeting in the mix somewhere too. But
They're probably eating good.
I suspect they'll have some niceties there. But no, I think it is important. And to sort of make that case, I think we have to go back to origin in terms of like how the G7 really was started, and post-war finance and trade was falling apart in the early 70s. You had this kind of trade disruption, you had energy insecurity, you had wild inflation hitting consumer markets and disrupting supply chains. It started really with the finance ministers and the governors of the banks, the central banks, having a meeting and saying, look, we need to come up with another system so that there are some common rules and approaches, because we have too much at stake. If this continues, it'll be full chaos. So if I fast forward 50 years to today, we have a trade environment that is heavily disrupted. We have a lot of insecurity around energy systems, the inflation that we've all been living with. And as we saw in 2023 into 2024, a majority of the world had elections. That said, the agenda is pretty serious. I mean, they're talking about big things, and the G7 has done big things before. I mean, the G7 is the table where, nuclear proliferation decisions were made, about getting like dirty nukes out of, the former Soviet Union to make sure that they didn't fall into the hands of the wrong people. It's where things like, the riverboat people, relocating, out of Vietnam, into other world communities, other countries. And those decisions were really made and started by the G7. So it's an informal group. It doesn't have a secretariat, so it's really up to the host country and to the level of ambition that the leaders bring to the table.
Why is this an important G7 summit, particularly for Canada or for Mark Carney? Why is this important for us?
We're in a situation where I don't think, and the Prime Minister's been pretty clear that this is his view as well, like we're not going back to the way things were. We should not be arguing for the status quo. We should not be trying to get back to some nostalgic vision of the past. And we should not bury our heads and just say, oh, you know what? The U.S. has ripped up a trade agreement with us twice now in a row. But the third time, maybe it'll stick. So, the reality is we're always going to trade with the U.S. They're always going to be probably our first customer, our top customer. But, and there's the but, we need to be smarter and more diversified in who we're trading with. But we're very complacent. It takes time and it takes money to develop those trade relationships. And so when I look at who's being invited to the G7 this year, I think it's a very strategic play. It's like we need to really strengthen our ties to historic allies in Europe, such as England, France, the UK, France, Germany, Italy. We have deep ties to all of them. We have long-standing relationship with Japan. We were one of the first countries to open an embassy in Japan. And then there's a whole big part of the world, the emerging global south, that is growing faster than any of these G7 nations' economies are growing. And there's a real need to say, where can Canada be a partner there? Where can we benefit? And where can we be also a bit of a stabilizing force? We're a middle power. We've always described ourselves that way. But we're a broker. We're somebody that can build trust and linkages between countries.
Let's talk a little bit about some of these invitations that have garnered some kind of controversy and public reaction. India, who is in attendance at the G7 summit, and Saudi Arabia, who is not. There's been a lot of pushback about these invitations. There's currently an active investigation, an RCMP investigation into whether or not the Indian government was involved in the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in BC. Is this like global repositioning how you explain or make sense of these invitations?
Yeah, I think it's a different approach. And I think we're all kind of seeing that Prime Minister Carney has a very different approach than Prime Minister Trudeau did. And I think these invitations underscore that, right or wrong. And I think, history will be the judge. We'll look back and determine that later. There have been concerns raised by certain parties that Canada has spent some time kind of lecturing other parts of the world of recent days. And so there's this sense that instead of exporting our goods, we've been trying to export our values. And that is usually not well received on the other end.
But does that mean that we just do business trumps all and we should disregard some of the concerns? Yeah, how do you think through that then?
No, it's not just about business. I mean, we're not in Haiti helping out. We were asked to be, and we said, no, we can't, or we won't. And it wasn't clear, can we or won't we? And if we can't, is that because we haven't been investing in our defense and our military and our peacekeeping, and we don't have that capacity any longer? So it's not just about business. It's about the role we play in the world too, and are we being that global leader that we like to tell ourselves we are? But coming back to the India question, I mean, the allegation of extrajudicial assassination and politically motivated assassination on foreign soil is pretty severe and pretty serious. The investigation aside, not to diminish that investigation, but to say on the longer track, Canada has a lot of interest in being close to India and developing that relationship. And, we were pretty close to a trade deal before these allegations started. And, the hope is once the legal process is fully borne out, we can get back to that, because over time, there's a lot of growth there. There's a lot of opportunity there, but there's a lot of benefit for Canada too.
Mark Carney has said that Washington and the United States no longer plays a predominant role on the world stage, that they're pulling back from their, global leader position. Do you think Carney could step in and actually reorient the world order?
No, and I don't think he's trying to do that, but I think the soft power piece is important here. So what you see right now is, yes, there is a retrenchment or a maybe turning inward by the United States. They're also seriously cutting back on some of the things that they do for the rest of the world, and which has cost them a lot of money. And so that's why you see things like the USAID dismantling, and you see major programs that are global in nature being canceled or seriously diminished. And that is coming back to the debt crisis the U.S. faces. But there's many people who have kind of opined on this, which is that the U.S. is also realizing that its days as like the singular superpower in that kind of, post-Cold War era is done. And so are we moving into another, Cold War where there's, or kind of this dual polar world where there's like a Chinese and an American sphere? Or are we moving into something called a multipolar phase where, Russia exerts a sphere of influence, China exerts a sphere of influence, the US does, and others. The world is feeling increasingly dangerous. We're seeing more and more regional conflicts that are explosive in nature. A land war in Europe, the Middle East is a powder keg. Areas of Africa are still distressingly insecure and full of conflict and not even getting any attention. And you have, some pretty serious tensions in the areas around China, North Korea, and so forth that I've already referenced. So as the world becomes that much more dangerous, you see the U.S. kind of pulling back from the good work it's done in the past. It's also becoming more militaristic. It's investing more in its hard power. And it's sort of saying, we're going to control the areas we can control. and we're going to have a really strong army. And so in that moment of moving to a hard power space, what Prime Minister Carney is doing with the G7 is saying there's still a pathway for soft power. And Canada right now has a time-limited opportunity, because we're the G7 president this year, at a moment, at a real kind of inflection point in the world, right? 2025, who thought it was going to be quite this way? So we have this lottery of getting the G7 presidency just at the moment that everything's turning sideways. And Prime Minister Carney is saying soft power is important. We need to be able to call a friend. We need to have that relationship so that if I call, the Prime Minister in the UK, or the new Chancellor in Germany, who's only been in the job for a couple months, he knows who I am. We have a relationship. He cares about our shared interest. And he also knows that last time we met, I was able to bring in, Modi from India and, bring in some other important players, and we made progress. And so are we fundamentally and permanently changing the world trade order? Who knows? We may look back 50 years from now and see the 2025 G7 summit in Canada as the moment that the beginning of the future system started.
In May, when Mark Carney visited Trump, he gave him a bunch of golf clubs so that when he visits Kananaskis for the G7, he can use them on the golf course. I'm hearing that the golf course is all prepped for a Trump arrival. It really feels like there's a lot of attention about what this one guy is doing at the G7. How much do you think this G7 is going to be about Trump?
He's the great disruptor. He's the unknown quantity. And I think there's probably been a lot of thought into how is the program designed? Where are the off-ramps? And what are some of those other distractions? That said, if you get him out there on a golf course and he spends some time with another couple of world leaders and he's standing in the sunshine and things are beautiful, like that's not such a bad play in my mind. Of course we're kind of feeding the ego, but hey, like it's all about being smart here. We can't be, we can't be so kind of Puritan about how we do this, that we don't give ourselves those opportunities.
One thing that I know that we can expect from the summit is this Kananaskis wildfire charter. It seems like this is Carney's way of fitting in some sort of climate discussion, but it also feels like this watered down climate discussion to try to make sure that the U.S. gets on board. Is this the only way that we can achieve some sort of global consensus, is by watering things down for the United States?
I think it's a fair question. I would start with, we can't make perfect the enemy of the good. So let's agree on where we can bring people to a shared problem. We're seeing these rage through the United States. You just need to look at California recently. We're seeing them rage through across Canada right now. Right now the air quality is terrible. The prairies, northern Ontario, all parts of the country are facing this. But you're seeing it in Europe too. It's just raging. Like last year through Portugal and Greece and big parts of Europe are confronted with this too. It's a major disruptor for the economies as well of all of these nations. And so they look at it through that lens and they say, hey, we can't maybe make this about, some unified approach to climate change, but we can start by doing some work here to talk about what makes our communities safe. And climate challenges are a big part of that. And so I think talking about forest fires and trying to identify, are there things that we can do? Are there resources and materials we can share? Is a way to kind of acknowledge that, but keep the issue warm. Sorry for the bad pun.
No, I like it. Warm and digestible for Trump. Matthew, on Monday, we learned that Mark Carney and Donald Trump are actually putting a deadline on ironing out bilateral trade irritants and getting some sort of deal on tariffs. They have a deadline of 30 days. You know, it seems like conversations between those two are going well. Trump was even wearing a pin with both flags on it. Do you think we'll see some trilateral conversations, Mexico, Canada, and the U.S.? I know that Mexican President Sheinbaum was invited as a +1 to the summit. Any thoughts?
I don't expect a big, wet inked agreement with fanfare. I don't expect the new NAFTA to be announced tomorrow. That's just not going to happen. But again, the fact that Sheinbaum is here signals, I think, Carney's savvy approach to this right now. Sheinbaum does not leave Mexico very often. It's quite a big deal that she's here at the G7 summit. To date, she has not had her one-on-one with Trump. And so, you could argue that Mexico's been doing very well right now in the dispute with the U.S. They've been keeping their powder dry, but they've been very firm in their response that they will retaliate and they will hold the U.S. to account in terms of this trade war. By coming here to Kananaskis, there's a certain risk for her, but I think it's a signal, again, of the potential and the goodwill that's there to try and move this forward. And so, regardless of what happens with the U.S., we need to have a good relationship with Mexico.
Do you think we can expect something tangible to come out of this summit, out of these meetings?
It depends on how you kind of view something as tangible. The fact that they managed to do it and that they've brought these different leaders here to the mountains in Canada is itself, in my opinion, a tangible outcome. To me, that is progress, and that is a good thing. A week ago, Prime Minister Carney made a pretty significant commitment to accelerating and meeting our NATO target of 2% this fiscal year. We need to show up and pony up for the commitments we've already made years and years ago to NATO, and then to go into the NATO Leaders Summit, and also where they're talking about adding to that total. They're looking over their shoulder at approaching war. I mean, that is what's happening here. They're looking at war getting closer, and they're saying it's time to invest in the sectors that help with deterrence, hopefully, or response if necessary. And that is what's happening at NATO right now. And so coming out of the G7 summit, connecting with these other global leaders and important economies, and then moving into the NATO Leaders Summit at a time of great uncertainty and danger. This is about being a leader in the world again and trying to shape the outcome of what we want to see in the world. And in my mind, Canada has done more in the last couple of months to get on that path than personally I've seen for some time.
Matthew, thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks, Noor. It was really fun.
That's been This Week in Canadian Politics. If you like this episode, please leave us a like, a comment, a subscribe, ring the bell to get notified when we publish. And if you want to support this show or the network, please, please, please go to Canadaland.com/join. And cut.